Alright, in this video we're going to talk about how to make text inside of Cinema. So there's two main ways to make text. One of them is going under Create Spline and going down to the text area right here. And this will make, basically it makes curves, or splines as Cinema calls them, and then we can create the surface based on that. Okay, so if I click on this, go to Object, you can see here's the text, so I can type in MACA. I always hit Enter. Pick the font. Whenever you do text inside of 3D, you really want to make sure you pick a good font. Something like this is probably not going to read very well in in 3D when it gets rendered out. Something typically bold is usually best. And you'll have a lot of the same stuff that you would have before. You know, here's the boldness of it, or regular, italic. Here's the alignment. Typically I go center or middle, that way it puts everything right in the middle. You'll also notice that it has some extra features here, like the height. Okay, so that's the actual size. Horizontal spacing, vertical spacing if you had multiple lines. Won't hit enter that time. There we go. Okay, so I don't need to worry about that with just the one line, but I obviously could. Separate letters, and this you'll see doesn't really do anything at this point, but when I create this into an actual surface, it'll actually bring these as separate pieces versus all being the same piece. Okay, so I'll leave that off for now. And then kerning. If you're unfamiliar with kerning, basically it controls the distance between each one of these letters. So one of the reasons that we need to worry about this is the A and the C here are too far apart. So it looks like this is one word and this is another word. So I would hit Show 3D GUI, and it's a pretty simple interface. Just click and drag, and you can bring letters closer together. So however far this distance is here, that's what I'm kind of getting at there. Okay, so there will be, obviously, the C is kind of covering a part of that. And the same thing there, I could scoot that A a little bit closer on that side. Don't overlook these things, because that's something that you could go through this entire project, get to the very end result, render it out, and then like, oh, I forgot I should have done that. And you gotta start back over, but you gotta do a lot more work. And then this is the direction. So you'll see this a lot in Cinema. Which plane do you want this to be created on? So typically I leave it as X, Y, unless I'm doing like an overhead shot or something. Reverse, this is basically going to be how the curves get created, but for what we're doing, we don't need to worry about that too much. And then intermediate points, we'll see once we start creating the surface. We'll start playing with some of these other things. All right, so I'm going to make this into a surface. So under this here, you'll see there is a, I lied, there it is, under this one here, you'll see there's an extrude. So I'm going to go to the extrude. I'm going to drop the text into it, or remember I can hold down Alt and then go to that extrude with the curve selected. And you'll see that it extrudes the text. It actually takes those curves and extrudes it, and we have thickness. We also have this GUI. The 3D GUI is still on, so I can click that off. I'm kind of done with that. And then let's look at some of the options we have. Under the extrude itself, I can control the movement, which is how much it's extruding. Okay. I have subdivisions. So how many subdivisions do I have here? I have isoparms. You're not going to see a huge difference at this point. We'll see that a little bit later. Hierarchical is if we had extra curves inside here. We don't need to worry about that. Flipping normals is if our text came in inside out. We don't need to worry about that. Cap is, right now this is blocky, completely blocky. It's one face, another face, and it's a perfect block. This is the cap here. There's a start cap and an end cap, okay, front and back. As I do this fillet, I can do a fillet without the cap. I can do just the cap, or I can do a fillet with a cap, okay? And sometimes you want or most of the time you want your text to have some kind of roundness to the edges. The defaults, unless your text is huge, are typically not good. So I typically take the radius down, and I'll take these steps up. And what that gives me is just a nice little curve there, so that as this kind of comes around, we get this nice rounding happening. And I'll typically do that to the back too, and I'll use pretty much the same settings, so 1 and 3. All right. If my text was bigger, then I can go with a higher radius, because that's just controlling the radius of that. And I may need more steps too, depending on what I have there. Some other stuff we can control. Let's zoom in here so we can see this. What kind of cap do we have? Right now we have a convex, which means it's rolling around it. You can play with the rest of these, but linear is just straight. Oops, not that. And then concave is like that. And then two-step is like this. Okay. And then more steps you have. Oops, right one. Oh, apparently we're not going to have any adjustment with that one. Okay. Cool. So that's what those different ones do. All right. Now, some of the other features on this, if we look at hull inwards, let's uncheck that. So you'll see how that's going to change the look of the text. Instead of going from the outside in, it's going from the cap here and then like dipping inward. Okay. So that's a feature that maybe you would want. Typically, I leave it at the hull inwards. Hole inwards is different. So if you watch the hole right here, you'll see how, again, I can control just that hole on the inside going in, just like this hull inwards was doing that. Constrain locks it to your curves here. So if I were to just disable this for a second and go into, let's say, the front view, as I re-enable this, the text actually goes a little bit beyond those curves. So if I look at where this curve is right here, this is where the text is. And as I disable that, you'll see how the original curve is actually inside of where that is. If I go to this extrude and I say constrain, it constrains it so it doesn't go beyond that. And the reason for that is, we spent time kind of spacing this apart. And if we didn't constrain it, we might get a little bit too close to some of these pieces here. Okay, in this case it's fine, but in some cases you don't want that. Okay. Some other things is create single object. So that's something, again, that we would want to pay attention to. When we create this as a solid object, we hit, let's say, C on it. We may want this to be a single object versus each letter presenting itself individually. Okay, so that's an important feature as well. And then the type is set to n-gons in this case. So I'm going to go to display and make sure my shading and lines are on, so we can see this. And I'm going to go to type n-gons, and n-gons just means it allows for a face to have any number of divisions. Okay, so this face right here, the cap, has like as many faces as are here. That's what we're seeing. So I'm going to change this to quads, and you'll see now we're getting a division on there, and it looks kind of ugly, especially like on a C, and it's pretty disproportionate. This piece is huge, this piece is small, these pieces are really tiny, but then there's a big piece. If I hit use regular grid, I get something that's a little bit more evenly distributed. Not perfect, but evenly distributed. Now these values only really come in when you do something outside the box of just having text. I can leave this as an n-gon if I'm just rendering out the text as is, just like a piece of text in my animation. Or each letter is a solid piece; they're not going to be broken up or anything. This comes in when you do different things. Maybe I want the text to be kind of squishy. I want it to fall down and kind of distort. That's where these other triangles or quads would come in. And even, as you look at them, you can kind of figure out which one's going to be the best. Typically, you'd want quads for your stuff. And sometimes you may have a value that you have to play with here to get a nice distribution. If this is set, let's say, too high, you're basically back at where you were before, right? So it's something that you have to be aware of, obviously, so you can play with that, okay? So that's one way to make text. I created the spline, and then I did an extrude on it. All right, so I'm just going to take this and just turn off the visibilities on those. The other way to create text is under Mograph Mo Text. Okay. Now, when you do Mograph stuff, this allows you to use other Mograph stuff on top of this, especially the effectors, which is what you would typically want to use this for. So that's where you could use that kind of tool. Okay. So you'll see a lot of the same options that we had here. Here's the depth. Okay. Here are subdivisions for the depth. Here's the font. Here is the bold, whatever, middle. Here's the height, just like before. Here's the horizontal spacing, vertical spacing. Show 3D GUI. And again, I would still go in here. It works the same way. Anytime you see that 3D GUI, it's still going to work the same way that you would have it. If you have a special font that you loaded or whatever, obviously you'd want to make sure too that that font gets loaded every time. Typically we don't want our letters to actually be touching. It's hard to see it sometimes in this perspective view, so usually I'll go into my front view, and that way I can kind of look at the spacing here and say, okay, that's probably good there. Okay, now let's look at the intermediate points here. So if I go to points, it's not going to show anything because I have that. But let's go to natural here, and we can see these. Okay, so looking at these lines, those are all the intermediate points. Okay. Basically, our curve has a line up here and a line down there. How many divisions do I want going along this line? When it's set to adaptive, it's kind of trying to figure out, okay, you have a straight line here, so we don't need that many divisions. But on the C, you have a lot of divisions going around in order to make this nice and smooth. If this line, if this number is not small enough, you'll see how the C turns out really blocky. Again, something you want to pay attention to, because that could screw with your stuff when you get to the end and you realize, holy crap, it's blocky, right? So sometimes you'll use adaptive if that's what you wanted, is just to have a nice, smooth character. Sometimes you want evenly sized polygons, evenly sized faces. So these ones being stretched out versus these ones being kind of smaller. I may want to go with natural, and you'll see how evenly distributed we get these faces on here, okay? And again, that would be for if the text is deforming or something, you don't want one area to be really deforming and another area not to be it, okay? And they all have options, and you can very quickly kind of see what those options are just by clicking on that. Here's 0, and then I can pull that up. And obviously, the more I have here, the smaller these pieces are, the rounder or smoother that C would be. Especially if you grab something that has like a lot of curvature to it. Let's grab this one. Nope, that's still not a good one. Styles. There we go. Okay, so something like this, you'll see there's a lot of curvature that happens in the A and the C, even around there. So having the right amount of divisions is definitely something you would want. Here's another one, subdivided. I encourage you with any of these just to go through and screw around with it. Just see what they do. Here's uniform, so obviously this is going to be uniformly spaced. Now that could cause some stuff. Let's look at the top of the A here. So you see the top of the A is pretty blocky, where the C is actually pretty smooth except for, let's say, this. So in this case I have to add, a few more. I'm going to zoom in on that C a bit more. Let's say I put this up to 10. Still not really smooth. Let's go to 15. Alright, so that's better, right? So I have to go up to 15 in order to get this nice and smooth, but at the cost of having that many divisions, where if I went to natural, they're all not perfectly sized, but you'll see in the areas where it needs it, it's adding more divisions, and where it doesn't need it, it's adding less divisions. Okay, so this gives you a nice, mixture or variety of those, alright? There's also shader indexing, which is an advanced thing. We're not going to get into that. And then you'll see caps. One thing about Cinema, if you have these tabs at the top highlighted, it'll actually load all of that into your slider here. So if I go back to Object, it doesn't show caps, but if I go to Object and Caps, it'll show caps at the bottom. So if you ever see anything like that, just be aware. Okay. All right. I'm going to go back to caps. And I'm going to go to my start point, and again we have those same things. Fillet caps, let's say 1 and 3, just like before. Let me pick a different font too, I really don't care for this font. I'll go with stencil, it's cool. Again, we have the height, we have horizontal spacing, that's the stuff we did, there we go. Okay, so we have same thing, so fillet type, all the same ones. Hull inwards, constrain, create single object, rounding, blah blah blah, regular grid. You see it's hard to see from there, so you turn the camera a little bit, and we get that same option. Okay. Now the other spots on here that we would get are these. And this is where we can really play with different things happening in this. Think of a motion graphics piece where you have text animating. If this was a bigger piece of text, we could play with the letters, we could play with the words, we could play with the lines, or we could play with the entire thing. So all of these effects are different effects that we could add to this specific thing. Okay. Whoops. So that would be the other way that you can create text inside of Cinema. And just so you can see again, I'm just going to duplicate this, or just so you can see it, not again, but see. If I hit C on this, this creates MACA, and you'll see that the way it created this motion text here, the Mo text, Mograph text, is by it created the M with the curve. So the same way that it did this one is how, if I hit C, it'll create those pieces, okay? And you'll see they're all individual pieces. Now let's duplicate that again. Let's scoot that forward. Go to caps, and I'm going to say create single object, and then I'll hit C. And now if I open this, it still creates them as separate pieces, okay? So even though it set it here, where is it? There, create single object, it didn't create a single object because of how Mo Text works. Right now it's a single object as a Mo Text piece, or it's treating the whole thing as a single object if this is clicked. But if this is clicked off, it'll actually treat each piece as an individual piece if I have that. Okay, so this will be an important thing when we get into animating text and moving all the pieces around. All right, so that's the gist of it. I think there was one more thing maybe I wanted to show. Nope, that was it. Okay, cool. So that's your text.